Hello, everyone. I have had another movie and TV slump, and I did not want to come here. And talk about something I didn't really care about. Maybe that's the whole point of making a YouTube channel and being consistent is that you talk about things you don't really want to talk about. But I don't want to. So today I'm going to talk about a book that really got me moving and thinking a lot about my own upbringing and place in society. And so I'm going to talk about the short story collection Rejection by Tony Tulatamite, and he is the latest literary figure to bridge into mainstream media with his short story collection, Rejection. The book consists of 7 interconnected stories that adeptly observe the millennial malaise of growing up on the internet where one's worst habits become amplified. While many people have described this book as quote-unquote incel literature, the true crux of the book is about the ails of mainstream identity politics and the way it serves to alienate and isolate people at the edge of society. So today I'm going to go through each story, what I believe are the most poignant anecdotes that point out the argument that Tula Tumite is trying to make. And I will also make note that in the last story, he basically points out his own perspective and their import on how the stories were written. Before I continue, I want to state that I believe identity politics are important. I think it helps people understand how a racialized society like America functions. However, Tula Tumite's argument comes down to how identity politics has limited bearing on the personal lives of individuals and someone's inability to disentangle their struggle from the broader social dynamics can lead to isolation and social ineptitude. And without further ado, let's get into his most famous story called The Feminist. So today I'm using this picture of a young Jeremy Allen White. And this is, of course, if you read my blog on Substack, you'll know that in the past week or so, I had seen Jeremy Allen White on the train. But I just want to point out Jeremy Allen White because even though I really find this pejorative and offensive, some people have put him in the category of having a quote-unquote rat face. I definitely disagree. But what I do want to say is that a lot of incels and people who sort of blame their physical features for why they're not romantically successful fail to understand that most romantic relationships are not exclusively based off of this fairy tale of you having the ideal body and then people pursuing it. A lot of it is personality. There are so many people who just by virtue of their personality make themselves hotter despite having features that I'm sure on these incel forums many people would say are not great. Yes, Jeremy Allen White now is extremely jacked, and of course he has this extreme charisma that he touts about. But I don't think that that's natural, and one, and two, natural in the sense that like he grew up with it. He clearly worked towards that aesthetic. And then two, I don't think that's why he's an attractive figure just because he acquired this body. I think he's just a great actor and he knows how to move a room. He knows how to implement his charisma when necessary. So personality matters a lot. You might not have the ideal body shape, but at the end of the day, you are going to still be able to get a partner if you truly are being an attractive person with your personality. So without further ado, let's get into the plot of this film. Look at Muscle Memory, not film, short story collection. The Feminist is about an unnamed protagonist who has shaped his entire identity around being a self-proclaimed feminist. He is obsessed with getting into a relationship and doesn't understand why all his attempts lead to him being friend-zoned. The protagonist believes that because he is a feminist, he is the ideal partner for women who constantly complain about being mistreated by misogynistic men. The story uses a close third person to show how debilitating anxiety and overthinking leads to him to come off as strange and off-putting to any potential partners. For example, his dating profile reads this, and I'm going to take the book and read this dating profile, which is extremely fascinating. So he has his pronouns, he, him, his, or whatever pronouns you are most comfortable with, right? So he's a feminist by allowing women to give him whatever pronouns they think is necessary. Unshakably serious about consent, abortion's #1 fan, loves books, Thai food, a glass of vino verde on my balcony, endless conversation. And did I mention books? silly emoji face. I can usually be found haunting the bookstores and bake shops of our Fairburr when I'm not dismantling the imperialist male supremacist heteropatriarchy. But I'd also be fine saying to hell with it and staying at home for an Agnes Varda marathon sesh followed by discussion and perhaps a wee snog fest, winky face. I always do my own cooking, thanks mom, so I'll make a killer brunch for you. Trans women are women, duh, all races, ethnicities, and body types, but not all ages. Very welcome. Mutual GGG. So this is just sort of illustrating how this character is really obsessed with his ideology, and he uses that in place of having a personality and having, something beyond, these rote lines to describe himself with. He's using the ideology or what he perceives to be feminism as a salve as to why people should be attracted to him as a person, and not really developing a character. As he continues to age, having only had one sexual experience with a girl from high school, who we will see later in this collection, his frustration slowly turns into rage that his feminist ideology has not resulted in the affection he believes he deserves. Things escalate at a picnic where his QPOC agender friend, another person we will see again, points out his eerie obsession with getting into a relationship and his entitlement to a relationship based on his superficial identity as a feminist. As his QPOC friend was his last remaining touch with reality, he descends into deep isolation into his 40s. He now regards every evidence of other people in relationships as an affront to his own loneliness. At a restaurant, a kerfuffle turns into a full-blown assault. It's kind of like an accident assault, but I can, it's one of those things where you read it and you're like, I can see why you got upset, but also the reaction was really outsized. That serves as his last straw. He becomes a full hermit, resorting to online incel forums as an outlet for his outrage, and his belief that his thin shoulders are the reason for his lack of romantic companionship. He is not self-aware at all about how his attitude makes him off-putting to even the most sympathetic individuals, and his online activity only entrenches his belief that the world is not meant for him because of his canthal tilt and thin shoulders. In the final scene of the story, he returns to the restaurant where he believes he was assaulted, and it is implied that he mass murders as many people as he can. This story is the story that got Rejection the label of an incel story, but the story really begins the trend of talking about identity. As a white man, the protagonist was not able to participate in traditional identity trends that were taking place in the late 2000s and early 2010s. This protagonist instead decides to attach his identity to an ideology, which gives him proximity to marginal people, and also, by his skewed logic, entitles him to the people he allies himself to, right? So as a feminist, I am now allowed proximity to women, and he believes that this should, of course, be a shortcut to romanticism, but it's not. His identity as a feminist causes him to fail to self-actualize and become a human other people want to be around. By centering the so-called feminist ideology, he allowed himself to evade the reality of his circumstances that were completely in his control to change. There is nothing anyone can do to avoid social rejection. It happens, and we should all see it as a sign that we are putting ourselves out there. But it is important that we use the rejection to learn about ourselves and what we can do to make our lives more fulfilling. Craig, who we learn is the name of this protagonist, the feminist, failed to truly take accountability for how he presents in society beyond his physical features and surface level takes on feminism. Had he taken a step back and allowed himself to see his character outside of a boxed-in identity, he would understand how minor changes would have made the world of difference in his success in friendship and romantic relationship. And another thing I will say, and this is a theme throughout the short story collection, is that there's almost, I wouldn't say an obsessiveness with romantic relationships, but as somebody who also, I will be honest, I struggle socially. My priority is friendships. I feel like friendships are the gateway to good romantic relationships. And this, I think the reason why so many people focus on romantic relationships is it's one of the only relationships where there's almost this expectation that your partner is going to be everything for you, right? Like this idea that your partner is your best friend, your lover, also your partner in business, and in home life, and they can be everything for you, and it makes it feel as though you should prioritize romantic relationships. But if you don't have friendships down pat, or even family relationships down, romantic relationships are going to be nearly impossible. So that's The Feminist, and I thought it was a really interesting story. It definitely delves into the psychology of how somebody might get to the point of an incel. I think Elliot Rodger is somebody who also you would be look at, and you look at his life and you're like, it's not that bad, bro, and you're not that bad looking, but you could see how you kind of expect 1+1 = 2 when the world has no formula and social interactions have no formula, and your inability to leave that formula and just exist and try to be as best of a person as you can is going to stymie you from, reaching your full potential. So this was a character I was sympathetic for like the first half, and then the second half you're just like, you are so annoying. And that's a horrible thing to say, I think, to an extent, because what if somebody had that patience with him? What could he have become? We'll never know, and the story doesn't matter. It doesn't care about that. So let's get into Allison with the story picks. So here is a picture of Mae Whitman. For those who don't know, she was in the show Parenthood. She was wonderful, and she was my favorite character. I was obsessed with that show, Parenthood. And then she also starred in the show called The Duff. And I think the reason why I chose Mae Whitman to represent Allison in the short story picks is because The Duff is about basically Mae Whitman playing this character who's just so ugly and fat that she's not cool and she's not attractive to like the popular kids. But then when you think about it, Mae Whitman doesn't look that bad. Even I looked at some of her pictures from Parenthood. She also didn't look that bad. Of course, she's supposed to represent this daughter of a working class woman. So they judge, they mess her up a little bit. But this is literally her at the premiere of the film that is supposed to say that she's a fat friend. And it's like, this is a normal weight woman. And I think that Allison fits in that category. And it's really interesting to think about because in The Feminist, we hear Craig talk about Allison being fat and what have you, but I genuinely think that she might have maxed out at 10 pounds more than this picture of Mae Whitman. And it's just like the sad reality that a lot of women, and I would say a lot of women in mainstream white culture, as a black person, I will say that the scale of weight is a little bit different, but a mainstream white woman, she wasn't really that big, but she just wasn't, Zendaya thin or Bella Hadid thin. And of course that can breed insecurity, but there was no reason for her to be that way. But yeah, let's get into why I consider her obsessive, elitist, racist, alcoholism, suffering from it, and having superficial friends. So the protagonist of the second short story picks is Allison, who we met in The Feminist as the woman who took the feminist virginity. Not really. If you read The Feminist, you'll realize, I don't know if that's, he's no longer a virgin anymore. Regardless, we learned that Allison is a woman with a food eating disorder who has a good male friend named Neil. While enjoying their monthly meal and movie night, Neil uncharacteristically kisses her, which leads to the pair having sex. She immediately becomes attached to the idea of pursuing a relationship with Neil. She has this superficial friend group made of people that she did an internship with once, and after the hookup, she immediately lets them know about her feat and looks to them for her validation. So it's kind of clear that this friend group is just uses their group chat to talk about their exploits, their sexual exploits. And I think it's something that a lot of millennial women did. I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit older now, but a lot of millennial women did to show, hey, I'm a sex positive woman. I'm out here having sex with men. So sometimes some group chats just consisted of women talking about their hookups. The text messages and their integration in the story is one of the greatest feats of this short story collection. And just in general, I'm going to briefly talk about how Tula Temite, and I also don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but I am phonetically doing my best, but how Tula Temite Mute really kind of puts into context this idea that, sorry, my brain just kind of went blank, puts in this idea that the way we communicate today is through technology. The stories don't change, right? This idea that an Allison type character would be involved in Pride and Prejudice or any variation, or even like Homer's Odyssey, right? She exists there. There's just like text messages don't exist. But if you're going to write a contemporary story, text messages, Reddit, Twitter, all these factors are going to be involved. And I really like how Tony was like, you know what? This is a part of our modern day life. So I'm going to find a way for literary fiction, those snooty, toity people, to accept, a writing of a Reddit post as a literary story. So anyway, At the next meetup with Neil, he makes clear that he does not want to pursue further sex or romantic relationship with Allison. Allison does her big one here by making it seem like Neil was manipulating her just to get sex. Her neuroticism comes into full gear when it's clear that she cannot move past Neil's rejection of her. She becomes obsessed with Neil and cyberstalks him and villainizes him for not wanting to pursue a relationship with her. But they do meet again, and Neil brings a girl named Cece. This is an Asian woman, a younger Asian woman. We are then introduced to Allison's alcohol issue, which causes her to drink too much and bring up in front of Cece that she slept with Neil and the details of said tryst. Neil emails her the next day about the status of their relationship and his disappointment in his behavior, right? This is really disruptive. He's met this new girl. He said that he doesn't date her, and she just kind of goes on this tirade about how she kind of thinks he's a bad sort of partner or what have you. When she responds in a way that she thinks will make him apologize for wrongs he never did, he responds nonchalantly and she blows up her text message thread. Here it becomes clear that the members of the text thread regard Allison at arm's length and with hesitation, seeing that she's blowing things out of proportion and can't see her wrongs. Allison also makes racial comments about the girl Neil brought to the dinner, without considering that some members of the group chat are Asian and offended by her characterization, even though, quite frankly, even if there was no one Asian in that group chat, it was very stereotypical the way that she described the Asian girl and infantilized her in this idea of, this stereotyped idea of the Asian woman as a perpetual baby or the perpetual sort of, I guess a lot of people stereotype Asian women as this perpetual pick-me, but she's not. She's just a woman. So the group tried to push her towards therapy and prescription does, but Allison is resistant to their suggestions. And again, this is something that I think plays a role here. Also, what was really cool is that this story shows how therapy can be sort of hijacked by somebody with malintent. This is something that I've always thought about therapy in general. When somebody looks at someone and says, hey, you should go to therapy, what people have to understand is that for the therapy to work the way that people expect it to work, the person has to see themselves the way that other people see them. And oftentimes that is the biggest issue, because the person is not going to go into that therapy session and describe themselves in the way that you see them. They're going to describe themselves in the way that they see themselves. Okay, and that's kind of confusing with all the pronouns I just injected into there. But that's important because the therapist can only do so much in terms of assessing where a client is really coming from, and it's not in the best interest of the therapist to create this antagonistic relationship with the client where they're constantly saying is that really what happened? Is that is that true? And of course, even then, you have really smart people who are able to characterize things in a way that a therapist, even a very smart one, isn't going to be able to detect anything off in regard to this person's, depiction of what has happened. So, you see Allison therapy doesn't work for her because she really struggles with seeing herself in the way that other people see her. And that's very evident in this text message thread. Allison persists in her perception that she has been wronged by Neil and descends into a depression spiral. She gives up dating after a night with the feminist and isolates herself. She continues to drink and also starts to binge eat again. She gets a bird without doing sufficient research on the care necessities, and unsurprisingly, the bird is not the salve she thought it would be, and in fact exacerbates her stress. The story also delves into how therapy can be used by maladaptive people to further entrench their bad behavior, as I previously mentioned. In a climactic scene, Allison decides to host her group chat at a holiday potluck. We learn that a member of the group chat has a child and is pregnant, something that Allison did not know, showing how superficial their relationships are. I will say, because I don't think the story really gives us any hint that we shouldn't believe this, but it is kind of rude to bring a child to somebody's house without fair warning. And maybe there's something about Allison being an unreliable narrator in the sense that you can imagine in her depression spiral, she just didn't read all the text messages that were coming through. And one of those text messages might have just been, hey, is it okay if I bring my child? All right, I'm bringing my child because I can't find, childcare at this time. But yes, I would say that and I like that how Tula Mut does this. Oh my God. Anyway, I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong. How he puts it, because it's really sort of this thing where it's like, yes, with all these characters and all these stories, there's oftentimes objectively something that other people do wrong, but worst part of it is how other people react to it and how the protagonist reacts to it and then blows it way out of proportion. So at this potluck, nobody eats the food. Girl cannot cook. And towards the end, the child enters the room where the feral bird has been sequestered. The group see the bird as a threat, but in an attempt to prove the bird is harmless, Allison gets her tendons ripped from her hand that causes permanent nerve issues. Again, instead of using this as a light bulb moment, Allison tries to get the mother in the group, Naima is her name, to pay for the stain left on her couch. So Naima put oils in her, cooch area because she's pregnant, so she's trying to help reduce or induce contractions in an appropriate way. Tensions escalate in the group chat, and it's clear that nobody in that group chat liked her. They already had a separate group chat, which you always could tell when it's like somebody has a separate group chat, when it's like you always find things out just a little bit too late. Like, if you guys were really planning this, why wasn't I involved anyway? As somebody who often gets a separate group chat made after them. Actually, not really. I'm over exaggerating. With Allison insulting everyone and everyone responding by leaving the group chat. So she's essentially left isolated. Despite this being a superficial friend group, it was her last tether to reality. Neil then invites Allison to his wedding, to the woman he brought on their dinner catch-up. Allison is attached to the fact that she thinks he lied about his dating status at that dinner several years ago and feels like she will be able to make him apologize about whatever she thinks went wrong. At the end, she becomes a drunken mess and essentially ruins the vibes of the wedding with her presence and off-kilter conversation with Neil. She wakes up the next day vowing to herself to a nihilistic life where she doesn't give herself the ability to feel. Ultimately, Pix is a story about a protagonist who identifies himself as a victim. Because Allison is always the victim, she cannot see her blatant contributions to the messes she's in. Because she cannot see her flaws, she's bound to repeat them again, with the stakes increasing with every mistake. This story just had the chaotic kinetic energy of a film like Uncut Gems. You're watching someone ruin their lives, knowing that nothing is going to change, but having limited ability to turn away from the train wreck. However, if there was a train wreck I wanted to turn away from, it was a Hageo. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. I probably should have looked that up before I made this video. But it's late and I gotta get up at 5 tomorrow, so I'm just gonna finish this video. Ahayego, or the Ballad of Sexual Repression. This was a story, at first I was like, because I remember reading some reviews and people were like, all of these stories aren't connected. I was like, well, this one doesn't seem connected. It is connected, and actually in a really cool way. Anyway, this is a picture, for those who might be wondering, of the first Thai American to be elected to office in America, and his name is Henry Charoen. Charoen. I am so bad with names. Oh God. Anyway, he was elected in 2006. The reason I chose this photo, did I just Google Thai Americans and also started actually reading the articles associated with the images that came up because I was just fascinated in Thai Americans in general, and then found it really cool that this was the first Thai American who was elected into office. Yes, that's what happened. But I also think that this is a visual representation in my mind of what this character of Kant, the protagonist in this short story, would look like. And I'll explain a little bit why as I describe the plot of the story. So let's go into it. Ahagayo is the first story where we have a remotely, and I really say remotely, sympathetic protagonist. The story follows Kant, a Thai American in his 30s who has recently come out to his families and friends. The response was muted, but it reflects his muted life. Kant lives a comfortable life as a game developer or something involved with game developing, but has a nearly debilitating relationship to dom porn. Kant's relationship to porn has made pursuing a relationship difficult because he's constantly confronted with the fact that he does not look like the person he wants to be in the relationship, and no one is the person he fantasizes about. In his attempts to make himself more like his fantasy, he goes to the gym where he meets Julian. Julian appears to be a run-of-the-mill white gay man who is genuinely attracted to Kant. On their first date, they try to have sex, but it is unsuccessful. Despite the lack of sex, the couple continue to see each other and essentially live a domestic life. All indication points to Julian being sincere in his affection for Kant, but Kant can't receive it and treats the relationship like an accounting ledger where he's doing a lot for Julian and secretly resenting Julian for it, because he's doing these things for Julian because he believes that that's what is going to make him a worthy partner to Julian. Right. And so the reason I bring this up, right, is I think with all these characters, they have a really skewed sense of self. And I believe Henry here in this picture is actually quite good looking. He's well above average in my opinion. But you can imagine somebody who's sort of like, I see myself as this 6'4" tall, 6-pack ripped guy with giant, vein bulging, dick. Like, you could see how that would be in opposition to how he actually looks, even though he looks fine and quite attractive. And you can imagine somebody like a Julian seeing this person at the gym and being like, oh, that's a good looking dude. I wonder if he's gay. I wonder if he would go on a date with me. Ceci, la. But yeah, I just, this is kind of sad. This whole story is sad, but I just wanted to point out why I chose Henry, because I do think he looks like, in my mind, the way that Kant would look like. Anyway, as their relationship progresses, they go to a group event with Julian's friends. Here, Kant is confronted with how out of place he is with Julian's social milieu, and of course this brings up a lot of bad memories he had with bullying when he was in school. Julian recognizes Kant's discomfort, and after the event apologizes for his friends and their elitism. However, Kant is reluctant to take Julian's apology at face value. The writing here reveals how Kant's self-deprecation is a form of harm to the people around him who just want to show him love, right? And it was the frustrating scene, because at least I felt like Julian was being sincere, no matter how, like, off-putting it might have been to hear that from your partner. But Kant can't receive it because Kant sees himself as so small and so little and so unimportant that he just can't imagine why Julian would be attracted to him. Even though, of course, everything shows that this is a man with a stable life who gives a lot to Julian and has a lot to offer. One day, Kant sees a text message from Julian's ex, which makes clear that the ex-boyfriend is racist, and finds it funny that Kant and Julian don't have sex. With much cajoling, Julian convinces Kant to tell him about his sexual fantasies. After a protracted period of weird descriptions, getting Julian nowhere closer to represent Kant's fantasy, Kant leaves and ends the relationship. It's just so abrupt, and it's clear that he's just self-sabotaging at this point, despite, again, every effort from Julian's point to make this relationship work. Kant then proceeds to email an adult content creator about recreating his ideal sexual fantasy in video. This is an extremely long section of the book that I have to admit was very hard to get through due to the intense graphic nature of the request. I was reading this on the subway and I was like, girl, this is wrong. And it was just so weird to read it. Anyway, eventually the email does end, but we learn that instead of sending the graphic email to the content creator, Kant has accidentally sent the email to people he announced his coming out to. Here, Kant identifies himself as a permanent loser. He has not grown from his identity, the identity that his school bullies put on him. The storyline with Julian is a perfect example of how people with debilitatingly low self-esteem can become a menace to those that love them. Kant is nowhere near as destructive as Craig in the feminist story or Allison in Pix, but it's almost harder seeing somebody's action almost exclusively bring harm to themselves. So with the feminist, you see how in a very explicit manner Craig brings harm to a bunch of people in the restaurant, and with Allison you see how she kind of brings harm and stress to Neil's wife Cece, and also to all of her friend groups. But here Kant is literally the only person he's hurting is himself. And yeah, it's just really hard to imagine how he's going to get out of this, including especially after sending that graphic email to all those people. You want to tell Kant that he is not as down bad as he sees himself, but you know that he will never be able to receive it. And these are actually, I would argue, some of the people that really therapy needs to be for, but therapy will never reach, because these people will, even in therapy sessions, will probably be like, I don't really deserve the affection, even from this therapist who I'm paying to give stuff back for. I also want to mention how I said that he sees his relationship with Julian as a ledger. I kind of grew up with a family like that. Maybe it's just an immigrant family thing where it's like everything is not, in all relationships, regardless of culture, transaction is very important. But I would argue that there's something to be said about immigrant families where there is an explicit perception of what I owe you and what you owe me. And while it can be very beautiful in the sense of a child making enough money to take care of of their parents when they get older. There's also this toxic aspect of it as well, where it's like, I can't breathe without being reminded about everything that you've done for me, and it makes a relationship very tense and quite frankly just really stressful to be in. So let's get into our next story, talking about stressful relationships, our dope future. So I chose Bill Skarsgård to represent Max, who is the protagonist of the story. Bill Skarsgård is, notoriously plays creeps in all of the films that he's in. Recently, Nosferatu. I really love that film. But he plays creeps, but he also has a face that can look very, kind and nice. And of course, he's a Skarsgård. He's a good looking guy. So I chose him because I think that Max, this character, is somebody who probably in a day-to-day presents as quite normal, but there's something sinister and weird under the surface. So our dope future is set up as a Reddit post. Max is a tech entrepreneur that wants to understand why his relationship with Allison, yeah, I'm talking about that Allison from Pix, did not work out. Max cringingly uses hip language and slang that, while at times funny, is clearly overbearing. And I understood the comedic device that was being used there, but there were times where it's just like, damn, I just want to get through the story. Like, why do I got to see shiznits in there? But you understand that Tony Mute or Mut. I cannot pronounce your name. I'm so sorry. You could see that Tony is really trying to hone in on a particular type of, I would argue, white man who, again, tried to gain proximity to marginalized identity by using slang language. And of course, we also learned that Max was homeschooled. So I'm kind of spoiling the story. So let me just get back to the script and read what happened in our dope future. Max met Allison on a dating app and described her glowingly as having the ideal wide hip. This gives context to the fact that while Allison might be bigger maybe than some of her friends, she's not in a body that people writ large find repulsive. So we also learned that later in the story that the reason why Max really liked ideal wide hips is because he intends to have 12 babies. I'll get to that later. Anyway, Max and Allison go on a date where it's clear that Max is one of those life is hustle guys who can't see people beyond productivity and their ability to further his goals. 5 days after the date, Max asks Allison to go to Spain with him on business class. Allison goes despite being in an internship, and quite frankly, even not in an internship, any job wouldn't look kindly on somebody who goes MIA without giving sufficient notice. On the trip, Max love bombs her and presents himself as this multimillionaire able to buy her anything she wants. So within this short trip to Spain, right, he spends a lot of money, and you can understand how this might give somebody the impression that somebody is willing to spend a lot of money on you and lives a luxurious life. As a result of the impromptu trip, Allison is unsurprisingly let go from her job and intends to move back to Connecticut with her parents. However, Max presents her with the opportunity of staying with him for 6 months so she could figure things out. He also says that if things aren't working out in the 6 months, he will help her find her own place. Allison is reluctant, but at the last minute she agrees. But Max's life is nothing like how he lived in Spain. He lives in a small one-bedroom where he has a single occupancy Murphy bed. So literally the bed that he has cannot fit 2 people, so he has to bring in another bed for her. He doesn't have food in his apartment as he lives off a Soylent type product that he created, and it's about to expire. Max is obsessed with Allison, using the time that she is unemployed to maximize her productivity and reach her goals. However, as we learn, Allison does not really have dreams nor the drive to achieve those dreams. Max hijacks her phone to make it impossible for her to waste time on it. This frustrates Allison, who says she's unhappy with the arrangement, which makes Max upset because of what he believes he has done for her. After their fight, Allison resorts to sulking and being catatonic in the apartment. Max observes this through the cameras he keeps in his apartment. He is confused about what she was doing, although it's clear that she is in extreme depressed mental state, and we know that she's not taking any sort of medication and she's not really willing to go to therapy. She does this for 3 weeks, essentially not talking to Max unless it is curtly to yell at him some responses he has to his insistent questions. Max tries to stage an intervention by texting her friends from her phone. It's really weird. But the friends merely encourage Allison to leave Max. So it's this funny thing where you can imagine him crafting this text message, which we never see, talking about how she's despondent she is and how she doesn't like where she's at. And even within the subtext of that text that he sends, people could tell something is off with her partner, not necessarily her. When Allison tries to leave, Max reveals his true goals, which is basically to repopulate the Earth with offspring Genghis Khan style. He wants his offspring to basically be this self-sustaining family unit, and it's going to start with Allison bearing him 12 children. The idea is that Max will enforce his ideas using technology to live forever with Allison, who will co-manage this fundamentalist Mormon S-type structure. In the near future, he wants Allison to have 12 kids. Obviously, Allison breaks up with him after that, but he says he broke up with her. Anyway, he asked the Reddit forum what he could have done to convince Allison to stay. Max's subsequent edits point out that many people think he is a creep who kind of coerced a woman into this strange relationship. The commenters have also doxed him, and he claims that the doxing has no effect on the funding, although his subsequent actions show that it probably did have some effect on how he's able to move in the world. He starts his own Discord where he can find like-minded people. We learned that Allison has also joined in on the online dogpiling. What's funny is that Max completely figures Allison out, but it's unfortunate that his description of her doesn't fit with the situation that he has with her, right? And this really does happen a lot where, people get called out for who they are by less than savory figures, and despite those call-outs being very relevant to the individual, they don't get the due diligence because, again, it's an unsavory figure. So here is how Max describes Allison. It's mad easy to look back on a situation that didn't turn out the way you wanted and then scapegoat others for it, right? So, again, in this situation, she had all the reason to blame Max, although there is something to say about she still could have done better or maximized that time better, but regardless, like any online megalomaniac, Max takes the sovereign nation route and starts his own compound on a boat in the ocean. He references getting women onto the boat and impregnating them, but he does not get off scot-free. The Thai authorities capture his boat and allege that Max has been involved in human trafficking and infringing on Thai sovereignty. The story ends with him asking why, if he was such an evil person, no one had ever told him no. Here, Max identifies a successful entrepreneur who is singularly positioned to bring the future, who believes he is singularly positioned to bring the future of the world. Because he's so attached to this identity of being this big hotshot that is basically one step away from Jeff Bezos, he never questions the thoughts and ideas that come in his head. The story serves to criticize modern society veneration of tech bros who lost grip on their own humanity. So I thought that was a really cool story. Interestingly enough, of all the stories that I think could be like a full-blown, like either TV or movie, this story could, as you know, everyone might have a different thought. But I thought this was cool because, again, it's sort of saying, we often chastise people when they reach their lowest, when they're in jail or when they're being investigated or when a lawsuit drops. But the question is, how did we get to the point where, these egregious actions that we see a lot of these men, but also women take, how did we get to the point where they thought they could get away with it in the first place? And so we see that same thing happen here with Max, who as an online figure was able to find a bubble that reinforced all the thoughts that he had about the world. And so the last sort of real narrative style story that we see is in the story Main Character. Main character is about B, who we learn is Kant's sibling. B is also Craig's QPOC, a gender friend from The Feminist. And this is something I just thought about. It just really puts into context how Craig / The Feminist doesn't see people as people, because he never gives B a name. And of course, in The Feminist, he's not named either, but it's important to put into context that, like, he only sees B as a QPOC, a gender person, which is in fact antithetical to all the theories that B espouses that I will talk about soon. The story Main Character is told in the form of some special interest forum that speculates about the veracity of B. I'm trying to think, I'm not that online anymore, so I think it's like a Tumblr page or like a fanfic page that was used. Either way, in Main Character, we get the background of someone who's smart but off-putting and hermetic, like many of the other characters in the book. And actually, as you see, I write these descriptions about a lot of these characters, and I remember thinking as I was on Main Character, I was like, a lot of these characters have the same traits, which is fine and great, but I think it's cool to see how the same personality traits can show up very differently in different people. Either way, B grew up as a girl but sold their identity in middle school. Despite no longer taking on a conventional gender identity, they are also reluctant to identify as non-binary or agender. This leads to a prolonged confrontation at their undergrad co-op where people insist they take on the identity of Asian American and non-binary. I'm going to pause here. Somebody might be wondering, how did I get this picture of what visually looks, oh my God, why does this look like Jungkook from BTS? But what visually looks like a non-binary woman or wow, that was a hodgepodge. A non-binary person. Well, I just Googled it. Girl, you wouldn't imagine the weird things I did Googling just trying to get a picture. But I do think that, in my opinion, this is how B looks. And B looks very good looking, right? I think that goes without saying. I always imagine characters looking much better looking than maybe they describe themselves to be. But I felt like for this short story collection, it was especially relevant because these people had no sense of self-awareness. Anyway, B makes a compelling argument about how all these identity politics lead to further dehumanization and individuation. And lack of individuation, but the co-op has none of it. She's relegated to an outcast where her only friend is Craig, who again we later learn is a feminist. After undergrad, she tries to be normal and moves into a massive communal living building in San Francisco. Here she tries harder to fit in and befriends Zamira. Zamira claims to be Chinese Malaysian and a daughter of refugees. Zamira toxically uses identity politics to get out of her obligations and manipulates others to do her bidding. Everything hits the fan when Zamira tries to use her trauma to get out of paying rent, which ends the relationship since B is unwilling to join in Zamira's rent strike. B later learns that Zamira was lying about her background and was a middle-class white woman the whole time. Eventually, B has to move back to Western Massachusetts to care for their mother, excuse me for using the wrong pronouns there, who actually, you know what? B wouldn't give a fuck. B would not give a fuck. Anyway, B's mother is dying from cancer. While living with their mother, B develops an online addiction that primarily involves making fake accounts on Twitter to demonstrate their belief that identity doesn't matter. And it's interesting because B has very, very judgmental perspective on, porn addiction and what have you. And it's never, in the stories that are written about her Twitter adventures, she never describes it as an addiction, but it's clearly an addiction to be as hyper involved as they are in everything that's happening. To me, that screams an addiction. By cosplaying several people and having them fight each other, B reveals that online discourse is trite. The end goal is to undermine the belief that anyone online is real. And here B is obsessed with having no identity, which becomes identity in and of itself. So I found this story actually was, I would argue, my favorite story. It kind of was a more traditional narrative style, but at the same time, it informed you so much. And I felt like you really got to get to know the character of B very well in a way that wasn't necessarily all that reliant on like gags that you kind of saw with Ahegao. And Kant, or even with the feminists. So I really liked main character. But then we lead into the last two stories of the short story collection, which are called 16 Metaphors and Rejection. So both of these stories, the 16 metaphors are just 16 aphorisms that are written about rejection and tying that to the metaphor about catching fish in the sea. And of course, fish in the sea is the very common metaphor people use to talk about people pursuing romantic relationships, right? There's always another fish in the sea, but ultimately how the metaphor for fish in the sea is about rejection. And then rejection is kind of taking the perspective of a publisher or a publisher rejecting the stories. And I thought it was really cool, even though part of me was like, I see the stories a little bit differently. But one thing I did read in an earlier story, I believe it was in Pix, where it's very clear that there's sort of this resentment towards autofiction, but then Tony shows himself here, where it's like, is there really such thing as no autofiction? Like, you put pieces of yourself into stories, even if you're like the straight man in a story of a ridiculous person, right? You're putting yourself into these stories, and I thought that was really cool for him to confront that, but it sort of shows his own shortcomings, which is he's very self-involved, he's insecure about how people are going to receive the book, right? And so it's this weird thing where I liked it. I genuinely liked the story, but it's one of those things where it's like, if it were any less skilled writer, it would come off as so like, girl, like, now you made me take this story that I actually like and make me hate it, because Rejection is a story that kind of makes you feel like, well, we got to feel bad for Tony because, you know, Tony's sad. Tony's really nervous that you're not gonna like the stories, but I liked it. Surprisingly, it worked really well in sort of showing this idea that, yeah, even this writer who's really capable of writing these amazing, beautiful, you know, compelling short stories is extremely insecure and fears rejection. I actually, this is random, but I read a Grub Street, Grub Street usually follows or has writers write about their eating lives or what have you. And I remember, you know, I kind of built up Tony in my head after finishing this short story collection of like, wow, he must be a bigwig. You know, Pedro Pascal has DM'd him. It seems like everybody's talking about his short story collection. He must be rolling in money. And then to find out he has a roommate in Brooklyn, I was like, whoa. And first of all, I will say this book was just published in September 2024. So in terms of getting the money, it takes a while for the money to come. And he's still, you know, rent lease lasts for a year. There's other reasons why he might have a roommate. He might have a roommate just for mental sanity. I do think having a roommate, especially if they feel more on the normal spectrum, forces you to be more normal. I say this as somebody who currently lives by themselves in New York City. So yeah, anyway, that's a random thought because I kind of bigged up Tony based off of everything that I had heard about this collection prior to reading it. You know, Zadie Smith also loves this story. He has this, he has this workshop in Brooklyn, and he's able to get all these amazing, highly regarded writers there. And his life just seems so, and I don't say that offensively whatsoever. But you, in a way, like you can see Kant in him in the sense that's like, I wonder what happened to get him here. Anyway, I'm definitely going to try to read Private Citizen. Maybe I'll do more book reviews in more episodes. I am liking books more than I'm liking TV shows right now. And yeah, that's it. That's Rejection. I really like the story. I think it's really cool. I'm excited to see what private fiction is about, and an amazing writing style. I wish I could write like him. I definitely try to, you know, figure out ways that I could write in this style because it's phenomenal. But yeah, I highly recommend this book if you haven't read it. Quite frankly, if you listen to this entire video without reading the book, I'm kind of pissed because I prefer you read the book and form your own opinion, because it is one of those books that really kind of allows you to transport yourself and understand how you perceive things as well. And I think I saw a lot of myself in some of these characters, unfortunately, and that kind of made me depressed, but at least it didn't make me feel alone. So thank you for watching this video, and until next time, this was Strategic Delusion.